Thank you everyone for being here. Good afternoon and welcome to this lunch discussion on humans of the Indo-Pacific. And my name is Sunaina Kumar. I work with the Center for New Economic Diplomacy at the Observer Research Foundation. And I am your moderator for this event. The Indo-Pacific is home to more than half of the world's population and nearly 2/3 of the world's economy. The region faces many common challenges, from climate change to conflict to combating the economic and social crises wrought by the pandemic. There is an urgent need to replace sustainable development, to place it as the most important priority of the region, and the path to do that possibly lies in innovative public financing models. This session builds on the Conference on Sustainable Finance in the Indo-Pacific, which took place in Paris in February this year as a collaboration between the Observer Research Foundation, the French Development Agency, and the India Exim Bank, along with support from the European Union. Based on the conference, a report has been put together Reclaiming Development Pathways for Public Development Finance in the Indo-Pacific is an extremely timely document which we are releasing today. Before we begin, I would like to invite Mr. Bruno Bosle, the country director for AFD, the French Development Agency, to please come up on stage to release the report and also to share it with our panelists. Thank you. And if we can also request you to share a few words on the report.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Honorable Minister, distinguished representative of government and institutions, dear Observer Research Foundation colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here today, of course, at the Raisina Dialogue for this panel, for introducing this report which has been prepared by our Observer Research Foundation on the development agenda in the Indo-Pacific. Let me express my sincere thanks, of course, to Observer Research Foundation for this collaboration, and specifically my congratulations to Mir Sharma, who has been the one preparing this report and working closely with us on this one. This report is the first step in defining a common agenda for sustainable development in the Indo-Pacific. We also hope that it can contribute to a dynamic which could mobilize stakeholders of the region around a common vision and harmonize tools and approaches to materialize, in fact, this objective of achieving the sustainable development goals in the region. Let me explain in a few words why we have initiated this collaboration and why we are releasing this report today. The first reason for us is the necessity of a development agenda in the Indo-Pacific and the cooperation of financial institutions to achieve it. Indo-Pacific is usually a topic which is addressed under the strategic, the sovereignty, the security aspect, and not so much under the development angle. We do believe that there is a need, in fact, to work on these challenges, the development challenges in the Indo-Pacific, and alongside, of course, on the security agenda. The second good reason for us to work on this topic is, of course, how to gather like-minded stakeholders around initiatives which allow, in fact, to channel development finance toward more sustainability in the Indo-Pacific region. A comprehensive report is needed, and the global, in fact, mobilization require, in fact, to have a common vision of these challenges and how, of course, to address collectively these challenges. The third and last reason is that we foresee the need, in fact, to create collaborations not only between development finance institutions, but also with think tanks, which allow, in fact, to better identify the challenges, to bring, in fact, food for thoughts, and also to bring a different angle of these topics that we are usually addressing as a development institutions. Let me close this opening remarks with this last point, and of course to express my sincere thanks again to the Observer Research Foundation, our knowledge partner, for co-organizing this panel and of course for having prepared this report. I look forward to hear the views of the different panelists and of course I wish you everyone a very good panel. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for your support for this report. Please allow me to introduce our panelists now. Aditya Takri is Minister of Tourism and Environment, the Government of Maharashtra in India. Philippe Orliange is Executive Director, International Operations at AFD France. Javier Salido Ortiz is Director General for North America, Eastern Europe, Asia and the Pacific at Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Spain. Melinda Bohnen is Director Strategy at Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the United Kingdom. And Uduak Amimo is Acting Executive Director at Uriah Trust in Kenya. Thank you very much for joining us to discuss this critical topic today. Okay, Aditya, I would like to begin with you. Mumbai is of course very vulnerable to climate change, and this is a topic which is very close to your heart. How do you think the Indo-Pacific framework can be utilized for building sustainable cities?
Right, now that's actually, it expands across the globe because, the type of Indo-Pacific partnerships we've always heard about is about security, is about defense, it's about mutual cooperation in terms of, supporting each other in terms of each other's sovereignty and defense. But going beyond that, I think what we need to also understand is peace and prosperity is a major part of economic progress, and peace and prosperity can be sought in two ways. One is, of course, your defense in terms of the armed forces and the way we cooperate with each other on one. But when we speak about environment, today I'm seeing a lot of our countries, especially in the Indo-Pacific, being extremely vulnerable to climate change. You've got mass migration, you've got people and civilizations, you've got societies being hit by weather events that were not so frequent earlier, were seen as anomalies, were seen as erratic events, and now we've got these events on a year-to-year basis. For example, looking at our own region in Maharashtra, we've got the Raigad region, we've got the Konkan region, which is also a huge coastal region for us. We've got mangroves, we've got hills, we've got beaches, and we've got people staying there for years and years, generations, based, for whatever climatic conditions existed, staying on the hills, staying near the waters. And in the past 3 years, along with COVID, they've been hit by 3 huge storms and cyclones. They've been hit by landslides, and we've had to migrate them, we've had to move them. Now this migration, this change in terms of our livelihood, this change in terms of our life cycle, the way we live, is actually going to create a lot of disruptions within our own regions, leading to disruptions within the country, socio-economic disruptions in countries like ours where you have different castes, creeds, cultures coming together, disruptions in there, and that's going to create some sort of instability moving ahead. If at all we can create an alliance around the world, especially in the Indo-Pacific, in terms of how do we maneuver ourselves in terms of prevention or mitigation for climate action, and how do we move towards that, and 2, building resilience, and how do you actually respond to climate disasters. I think that is something which is very crucial, because many a times we see smaller island nations, we see smaller island states, islands, or even bigger countries like ours, when we are hit by climate disasters, our response is, of course, to go out there, help people. But how do you do that? What is the right way of doing it? Can we support each other? I think that is where we can all come together.
Thank you for that. Philippe, I'd like to bring you in. Aditya just talked about how we can build alliances. I would like to know from you about this report. What is the essence of this report? How does it talk about building new coalitions and also on innovative public financing for sustainable development?
Thank you very much, Sunaina. The initiative, the SUFIP initiative, was premised on the idea that to tackle the sort of challenges that Aditya has mentioned, we need 2 things. We need to reach scale, and we need to involve domestic public finance institutions precisely to do that. And the meeting convened 20-odd institutions belonging to that category of public development banks, plus a number of international actors. First, the purpose was to check whether this is an issue, a set of issues, whether the politics of sustainability can be an element of this Indo-Pacific agenda. And I think the response of the meeting was clearly yes. And what you've just said confirms that very, very clearly. Second is the issue of how then do we work together. Clearly, challenges such as the one that have been mentioned are of interest not only for the Indo-Pacific region, but for the entire global community. The success or failure of the Paris Agreement on greenhouse gases emission relies to a large extent to what is going to happen in this region in terms of greenhouse emission. The response to challenges of adaptation to climate change also depends on what we'll be able to do or not, will fail to do in the Indo-Pacific. Then you need to bring to the table, when it comes to financing investment, a number of institutions, public institutions, whose collective weight, whose size in terms of balance sheet, whose leveraging capacity, can mobilize direct public investment, can crowd in private investment, and receive some sort of support from international institutions. That's the logic of it. And these sort of alliances is something that public banks have been good at recently. You've probably heard about the International Development Finance Club, grouping the 26 development banks, national development banks from 26 countries, which is largely an emerging economy club. There are 4 European institutions, but the majority is made of public banks from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And these banks collectively have organized the Finance in Common Summit last year and the year before, which is also premised on the fact that public finance represents between 10 and 15% of the global investment. So if we manage to shift a portion of this financing towards a sustainable development agenda, towards the politics of sustainability, then the impact is likely to be significant.
Thank you. And you ended by talking about how we should shift some of the finance. And the report, in fact, talks about capitalizing on this moment that we find ourselves in, on the strategic spillover of the Indo-Pacific, and utilizing it for development. Melinda, I'd like to turn to you and get the perspective from the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. What are the development priorities and what are the public financing gaps that you see?
Brilliant, thank you. And it's a really, thank you for inviting me to speak on the panel, and it's a good opportunity to set out a little bit more about the UK perspective. So as many of you will know, the UK merged its development organisation, DFID, with the Foreign Office a couple of years ago. And we really used that as a moment to have a strategic rethink on international development policy in the round, with the fundamental question of how do we use development spend and development policy more broadly in a way that is complementary to and supports our wider foreign policy and international objectives, whether that be economic issues, trade issues, technology, partnerships, climate change, health. What does an integrated offer look like in this space? And we've been thinking hard about that, and we will bring forward a new international development strategy in the middle of May. I can tell you that sort of central to that are 5 key priorities: international investment, resilient investment, supporting countries to get the economic investment that they need for their economic and sustainable transitions is key. Humanitarian support, global health security, education, particularly girls' education, and of course climate change and the environment are all going to be front and centre. And alongside that, we will have, as the UK, a sort of full suite of positions, whether it be on security or international trade or international technology. And I mention all of that because I think it's important when we talk about the Indo-Pacific. So what we really want to do to be successful is make sure that we're using our development offer as a key flank of our foreign policy objectives here too. And for all the reasons that people have been talking about on this panel and in plenary, what happens in the Indo-Pacific region is so crucial for the future of the world in many respects, whether it is the security pillar, the economic growth pillar, or the climate change and environment and sustainability pillar. And that's really clear. So we need to make sure that our offer, our finance, and our policies are working in tune with that. And across this region, I think, what we would say is there are some incredible opportunities, actually. I mean, if you look at what needs to happen in the energy transition space, in the biodiversity protection space, but also the economic growth and transformation space, from energy access all the way through to energy supply, the potential for combined investment, public and private, for a broad range of stakeholder engagement, and to really make sure that doing all of that tackles poverty and deliver the SDGs is an incredibly exciting opportunity in this region. Of course, there are also challenges, humanitarian, governance, all the things that we know from our experience of international development around the world, small island developing states, what we've heard about the plight of SIDS in terms of ocean rise, are all critical challenges that we need to make sure our grant money is focused on. But we really want to make sure it's the combination of helping the region be the transformed, economically, sustainably resilient region it wants to be, working with stakeholders to make sure that regional connectivity plays a role, digital plays a role, identity plays a role, and all of that wrapped together in a coherent foreign policy that is that's savvy for the region's concerns over the medium term and ambition is very much at the heart of what we want to do.
Thanks, Melinda. Javier, we just heard from Melinda on what are the immediate priorities. If you were to tell us your view of a cooperation strategy in the Indo-Pacific from a development perspective and the view from Europe, what would you say?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Rayali. It's a pleasure to be here, Minister, colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen. I will address the question, and at the same time, being the first Spaniard, I think, to speak during this conference in Raisina, I feel I'm being the political director in charge of Eastern Europe. I will also address how the conflict in Ukraine has impacted, in our view, on these issues. I'm an economist by training, and I'm sure most of you have already heard that economists are not very good in forecasting, particularly when it's forecasting the future. And I think that has come to my mind very much and very often in the last few months. 3 months ago, when we were discussing inside the ministry what were our plans for 2023 and what were our priorities, our discussion was basically based on how we would handle the recovery from the COVID pandemic, how we would increase our cooperation or reinforce our cooperation on global issues in the Indo-Pacific, given a growing competitive environment, but how we could, find common ground and work on issuing common challenges like climate change, as the Minister has mentioned before, biodiversity, health issues, terrorism, or addressing the food insecurity that has been resulted actually from the COVID pandemic. Internally, and I can elaborate on that, we were planning a new cooperation law that gives a framework to our development cooperation policy. And within the European Union, we're discussing a lot on development finance, and Philippe has addressed that also partially on how do we use the development banks, basically, within the European Union, and also internally. And then the 24th of February happened, and everything changed. The illegal and unprovoked aggression of Russia to Ukraine has been a real game changer in international relations. And not only because it's a clear violation of international law and the international rules-based order that we all shared, probably in this room, not only because it creates a very dangerous precedent, not only in Europe, but in other areas of the world, including the Indo-Pacific, but also for the development consequences that it's having all around the world. The recent forecast by the World Bank predict that the Ukrainian GDP will be cut by half this year. In Europe right now, we are having over 5 million refugees, and there are 7 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. And Ukraine was a middle-income country, was a developing country before. But the consequences are not only happening in Europe, are happening also in the Indo-Pacific. The increase of food prices and commodities, the increase of fuel prices, which have been discussed in several debates these days in Raisina, are affecting also the populations in this region. And most likely, and this has been also addressed in some areas, the increase in inflation that is taking place in the United States, in Europe, is already causing an increase in interest rates that will have very profound impacts in many countries in the developing world, in the global south. Therefore, and I'll stop here because I'm getting too long, my conclusion right now is that probably the best development policy we can do in the short term is putting an end to this war as soon as possible. And in that sense, we are looking very much forward to working together with countries in the Indo-Pacific who have a very important role to play. I'm sure that I'll have time to address more of our cooperation in the medium term in the next occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Uduak, I'd like to bring you in now. Africa, along with South Asia, faces some of the most critical development challenges of this century. In that context, what do you think of utilizing the Indo-Pacific framework for furthering the politics of development?
Thank you. I'll update my bio just to say that I no longer run an NGO, and that changed this month. And I've gone back to coaching and consulting, running my own business. I'd also like to justify my presence on this panel because typically Indo-Pacific strategies exclude Africa. And so when you saw me flipping through the report, I was looking to see whether Africa was reflected there. I'm not sure that I did, but I'll have a closer look. So 9 African countries are part of the Indo-Pacific region. Eastern African countries, I am from an East African country, Kenya, and the island countries, small island nations. And you're quite right about the need to strengthen African-Asian development. And several informal alliances and forums exist, as well as more formal partnerships. Whether we're talking about Japan, TCAD, India's Africa Summit, the Sino-African Summit. But within the Indo-Pacific context specifically, we have the Indian Ocean Commission, we have the Indian Ocean Rim Association. But as we've been reflecting on throughout the Raisina Dialogue, we find ourselves at a critical point in global relations as a result of both COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And you will recall that Africa and Asia belong to the non-aligned movement, which for all intents and purposes exists only in name. But the moment that we find ourselves in seems to be calling for some sort of revitalization of that cooperation. Whether you call it the non-aligned movement or whether you refer to the 2005 restating of Africa-Asian Cooperation under the new Africa-Asia Development Corporation. Certainly the need for that exists. You saw it in the way that African countries have voted on Russia. You know, the first vote saw outright condemnation of the invasion. And the second vote at the Human Rights Council saw quite a few abstentions, pointing to the tension on the continent about how to respond to this, global event. And so there is room for Africa and Asia to restate, revitalize, and reimagine their partnership. And I think that has to do with broadening the actors in these partnerships. Typically, they occur at the geopolitical level through summits. We don't see enough geo-economic cooperation. If we do, it's one-sided. We don't see enough of the intellectual exchanges. We don't see enough of the civil society exchanges. We don't see enough cross-pollination. But it seems to me, and I don't speak for the African Union, that there will be a strengthening of this of the partnership. My understanding is that the African Union will have a summit next month where security and developments around counterterrorism will be on the table. And so we will see more talk of renewed partnership, whether it's under the framework of non-alignment or new partnerships of, around the global south. Thank you.
Thank you, Uduak. You have outlined the need for finding more immediate solutions. Aditya, national governments, of course, have prioritized the conversation on security framework when it comes to Indo-Pacific. But as we have seen with state governments, especially in the last couple of years, state governments like yours also, being more directly accountable to the people for delivering of development solutions. Do you feel that they will be at the forefront of this changing conversation?
I think that is a very, very important conversation we've got to have around the world, especially when you have, one of the things I noticed at COP26 also when we were there, is apart from the national governments interacting with each other, you also had a lot of regional cooperation, you had a lot of regional bilaterals going on, regional governments meeting each other at forums, at general assemblies. I think that is very important today. Because when most national governments have a conversation or when they go to forums and meetings or even bilaterals, it's the most current topics that are being discussed, especially currently with Ukraine or with other blips in, or rather events in our current times. But what we've got to realize is the Indo-Pacific also is about the future. It's got a shared past, we've got a current tense that was really tense, and we've got a shared future. But when we speak about the shared future, you've got to look at healthcare and how are we looking at healthcare, because COVID has taught us a lot. So how do we come out of it collectively? How do we avoid future pandemics like this? What is our response going to be there to that, as a shared response? So that is one, because more or less economically we're moving ahead and at a speed that cannot be controlled by anyone or restricted by anyone. So that is one. But when we speak about development again, for us as Maharashtra or for us as different regions around India and probably also, the crescent right from India to East African nations, we're looking at cities growing rapidly. We're looking at populations growing rapidly. We're looking at the need and urge for development on the high. And when we look at this, how short-term is a development or how long-term is a development? I think that is something we've got to really think about. When we have reports like, and congratulations to the AFD for this report, but when we have reports about, partnering for finances with private banks or with banks that are national, with agencies, with think tanks, we've also got to think about what are we looking at in terms of the next 50 years, the next 100 years. Is our development in terms of infrastructure, in terms of social development, in terms of socio-economic, political development, in terms of societal development, how sustainable is it? Is it going to last us for the next century? Because most of the thought process today is a very urgent thought process. It's about today, it's not about the tomorrow. And if we have forums, if we have think tanks that are thinking about tomorrow, we've got to look at our growing populations. We've got to look at the changing requirements of the population, the strata, the socio-economic strata that the population comes from and where it is heading towards, the requirements of energy security, the requirements of food security, healthcare. So all of these, I think it's very, very crucial for us to also have inter-regional dialogues for us where we're looking at, especially when we as India, also having different regions and states having huge populations. So we've got to have an inward and outward outlook. We've got to have more connectivity with the world, a thought process that is more global, as the popular term, because finally it's going to be the regional governments that are going to be implementing it. Is it practical enough to be implementing it in terms of the practicality of, is it possible today? Is it economically possible today? Is it socially acceptable for us? These are some of the conversations if we can have with our own national governments and with governments around the world, it's surely going to help the Indo-Pacific to move ahead.
So since we are looking at the Indo-Pacific of the future, Philippe, I would like to ask you, I know that the report has outlined some ways forward for regional cooperation, regional frameworks, more of regional banks and conferences. Can you share with us on what some of those solutions could be?
Thank you, Sunaina, and wish bon appétit to all participants. For us sitting on the fasting side of the conference, it's a pleasure with a sense of jealousy. I think among the avenues for possible future cooperation, there is certainly, like was mentioned by Aditya, cooperation between local governments. I think this is very important. For instance, in the OECD, 70% of public investment takes place at the level of local governments, be they provinces, departments, and cities. So that's an important element. And also cooperation between public entities. Let me mention here something that we're about to launch, cooperation between national parks. Based on the experience that I've just gained in Assam, we're about to launch, with the support of the French forestry administration, a cooperation that will also integrate national parks from other countries and regions of the Indo-Pacific, especially the eastern coast of Africa. So this sort of cooperation among practitioners, which is the essence also of the work that public development banks are trying to promote, are certainly an avenue which needs to be explored. Simply because work among practitioners is more likely to produce the sort of responses which are consistent with what the demand is, and our cooperation is basically and fundamentally demand-driven. But one can think of other examples, on connectivity, on blue economy, fisheries and ports, sustainable ports. There are lots of areas in which the Indo-Pacific either is already or could become a global laboratory of new forms, new modalities of cooperation.
Thank you. And we do expect our audience to work for their lunch. We will be opening it out in about 15-20 minutes to audience questions, and we would really want you to participate in this discussion. Melinda, I know that this is something that does interest you. The Indo-Pacific has, of course, prioritized infrastructural partnerships and connectivity partnerships, which are posited as the opposite of the China model. How do you think that projects like the EU's Global Gateway Project, the United States Blue Dot Network, provide a sustainable development model?
So I think this is a really key question for everyone who's interested in understanding sustainable development in any region, let alone the Indo-Pacific. This sort of question about, one of the driving questions for the panel, what is the sort of, how do we think about China's fast funding in contrast to the West's sort of slower funding, high quality offer? And I think what's really important to start this conversation off is the fact that any investment is good for growth, right? I mean, we know that from history, and we know that in practice. But I think what's equally important to say is that that investment needs to be sustainable. It needs to support rather than undermine good governance, sound economic decision-making, transparency. And it needs to be done in a way which is fundamentally part of the vision of the long-term vision that I think we've had really well articulated by Aditya and others for that country in question. And what we've seen, this is also very true of the history and continents in Africa and parts of this region too, that the Chinese models offer some of that, but it does not offer all of that. Chinese lending is sort of notoriously no strings attached, but actually if you look into it, there are downsides, there are strings attached. Particularly when it comes to first loss, if the government is unable to repay, particularly in terms of transparency, particularly in terms of the debt burden that they place, can place, if not part of a sound economic management framework. So it's absolutely imperative, two things. Firstly, that we sort of call it funding from the West, but actually I don't really like that term. I mean, I think what we need to drive at is an economic investment model that is driven by investors who have a long-term interest in sound economic management and the sustainability of economic growth in that country, into sort of the infrastructure that will drive economic transformation in a way that creates jobs, tackles climate change, avoids environmental degradation, and reduces poverty. Now, that is absolutely feasible as long as governments have viable plans political will is in place to undertake the economic and governance reforms that are necessary for a conducive investment environment, and that investors, particularly, a lot of sort of Western donors, as it were, have bilateral models, and that's in contrast to China, which can operate at scale over a medium-term time horizon. But our bilateral models need aggregating into something that is more than the sum of its parts. And we saw that conversation, and we saw those coalitions come together time and again at the COP. They came together at the Glasgow COP. But, they need to come together and really sort of work together on what it will take to provide long-term, honest, reliable investment at the right price and on the right terms. And for sure, financial innovation amongst those groups is a critical part of that. Risk sharing, risk pooling, guarantee mechanisms are a fundamental part of that. But, with that sort of those coalitions of financiers who are able to offer transparent, sustained, long-term investment supporting countries' economic and resilience transitions is absolutely key. But the other part of it, and I really want to emphasize this, is that they need to be part and parcel of, and many governments have them in the form of their NDCs, but they need to become investable, bankable propositions that work for the medium term. And it's that ecosystem coming together that will support resilient economic transitions. And that ecosystem will, I think, over time, see many countries turn towards better sources of funding and away from the short-term, supposedly no strings attached China offer that we see inherent in the Belt and Road Initiative.
Javier, I would also like to hear your view on this. How do we differentiate the Indo-Pacific model of development from the Chinese model, and also the risk of debts and deficits that already some states are facing, and how can the Indo-Pacific bypass that?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Rayali. I'll address the question in a wider sense in how we view our cooperation maybe with the Indo-Pacific, and I think the contrast that it does have with other actors. Let me first state that the way we view it from Spain has a lot to do with our membership of the European Union. We believe that Europe it's an important economic and partner within the Pacific region, but it does also have to play a political role in the region. And in that sense, we think Europe has to be relevant in the Indo-Pacific. We as Spain, we think we are a relevant country within the European Union. We are one of the bigger countries in the EU. We have a key role in shaping EU policies. So we want to influence and defend our interests and our principles towards the Indo-Pacific through the European Union policies too, basically. As you know, the European Union adopted an Indo-Pacific strategy last year, and we are currently in the implementation process. And in that sense, what we are doing nationally is exactly mapping, having a mapping process, seeing what are our strengths and our interests in the development of that implementation of that Indo-Pacific strategy, and seeing how can we be more useful. What are our objectives in that sense within this European framework? Okay, we think that economic integration and reinforcing the links of Europe with the area are key. We need to increase the diversification and resilience of our economic models, and in that sense, reinforcing economic agreements that will give bigger certainty to investors and trading partners is very important. 2 days ago, President von der Leyen announced a Trade and Technology Council that will be established with India. We think it's a very good step in the right direction. Again, we need to align financing with these objectives. So when we are mapping, when we are implementing the strategy, we need to accompany with the financing instruments. We have the Global Gateway in the European Union. We need also to incentivize and work with private finance. In the end, Indo-Pacific is a very diverse environment. And by the way, in the Indo-Pacific strategy, it includes Eastern African countries. So at least that I can confirm that. So we need to work with an array of different instruments. And in that case, maybe the last thing I wanted to underline, and it connects very much with what Philippe was mentioning before, has to do with what we think the cooperation can be in many of the areas that has been. I personally have spent quite a bit time of my career in European Union and in the OECD. What do countries in the European Union and the OECD do all the time? Well, we compare, we have dialogues, we share experiences, we do peer learning, we learn from each other. We think that many of the challenges that the Indo-Pacific is facing right now are challenges that we are facing and have been facing too for quite some time. And in that sense, the dialogues are important. I just finished with a couple of national examples. Since we have here the Honorable Minister of Tourism, Spain has over 80, before the pandemic, we had over 80 million international tourists every year. We are one of the top leaders in the world, and we have a very important infrastructure and a lot of public knowledge in that sector, for example. It would be interesting to share experiences. I just came from a panel before regarding the energy transition, a top priority for all our countries. About nearly 10 years ago, coal was still an important energy source for electricity in Spain. Nowadays, it's marginal, less than 1%. We are over 50% on renewable energies. And at the same time, we've been able to develop an economic sector that provides over 100,000 jobs in our country. We think, again, that those are experiences, either both in the public sector or in the private sector, that are very useful to contrast with countries in this region and where we can learn from each other. Thank you.
Uduak, in your remarks, you had talked about how Africa is often left out of this conversation. Now, one of the things that is common to Africa, India, and many of the geographies of the Indo-Pacific is the role of young populations and also emerging technologies. In that, what do you see as the role that digital connectivity will play for sustainable development and also for cooperation between the Indo-Pacific countries?
You're quite right. Africa is the youngest continent, even though I'm not so young myself. And we believe, what are the projections? I think that by 2030, we will account for over 50% of the world's population, and the same is true of Asian countries. Asian countries, India, China, are fairly sophisticated in their technological advancements. But Africa isn't doing too badly either. Kenya, Rwanda are tech hubs. The startup economy is also, the startup ecosystem is also thriving in Africa in the same way that we leapfrogged what was it? There's the landline technology and leapfrogged into mobile technology. We do see those developments taking place. And so in terms of what partnership and collaboration would look like, even though like Spain, a country like Kenya earns most of its income from tourism. We're also known for our ecology, wildlife, and our biodiversity. In terms of cooperation, we have traditionally cooperated more with Western countries, whether it's European countries or the US. We don't see enough activity. We've seen very little activity in terms of technological support, technological vibrancy between Africa and Asia, and there are opportunities for that. Whether it's your startup ecosystem here in Bangalore, or Rwanda and Africa, that has not been exploited to its full potential. In terms of the funds that we see capitalizing technological startups, most of the Series A, B, C funding tends to come from America, Silicon Valley. We don't see much of that on the continent, although there is some presence, but none from Africa. The reality is that the exchanges typically happen geopolitically at the leadership level, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the interests of the common people on the ground. There is room for more of that, and that would take shape easily, even though we have mobile telephony from Asia represented in Africa, whether it's Huawei or Bharti Airtel. There isn't enough, it's not as vibrant as it could be. I'm trying to be diplomatic because I'm surrounded by diplomats, but there certainly is room for more exchange.
All right, we'd like to open this up to the audience. Yes, sir. Can we have a mic there? We just please do briefly introduce yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Rajiv Bhatia, I'm a former ambassador, and I work with Gateway House, a very prestigious think tank based in Mumbai. A special welcome to Mr. Aditya Takri. We do live in an unequal world. The panel has all the wisdom and monopoly of knowledge, and we are enjoying a 3-course meal here. I would especially recommend hosts to provide to the panel a 5-course meal very soon. My questions, there are 2 questions, if you allow, Madam Chair, to Monsieur Philippe Orliange. You referred to blue economy and specifically fisheries and ports and some other sectors. And we know that France is doing wonderful work in this field. Have you also encountered the challenge that blue economy is discussed much more in conference halls and think tank circles and much less in the corporate offices? So you are a leading figure in this field, and do you have some advice to share with us as to how we can convince the business community to become more active, that there is money to be made out of oceans as long as you don't destroy them? And my second question is to our sister from Kenya, where I served as High Commissioner a long time back. Please allow me to be frank. You know, Africa's disinterest in Indo-Pacific is partly due to the definitions originally proposed by the US and Australia when Indo-Pacific ended at India. But it was India and Japan which insisted that Africa must be included in the Indo-Pacific. So my question to you is it possible for you to think of creating a uniform platform of those 9 countries that you spoke about, who then can start dialogue with mechanisms such as Quad? Because you need not worry that this is some way to entrap you into some anti-China platform. Quad is doing a lot of good work. You know, emerging technologies, climate change, blue economy, connectivity, economic cooperation, development cooperation, all this is suitable to you. So do you think we can think in those lines? Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia. Philippe, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Ambassador, for your question and for your reference to the 5-course meal, which I'm really waiting to come. I think on the blue economy, like on other subjects, one of the critical factors to transform an issue which is being discussed in diplomatic circle into a reality is to involve practitioners in the sector, which is exactly what we've done. If I take the example of our cooperation in this area in Indonesia, where French port administrations have been brought into the picture, a structured dialogue has been put in place with the Indonesian port, and this has given a very strong push to the cooperation in that particular aspect of the blue economy. So I think this really is critical, and is a way to make sure that cooperation really starts. When the people most concerned by the subject are brought into the picture, it's like investment or whatever. I did not respond to Unua's question about whether Africa was present at SUFIP or not. Yes, 2 development banks, TDB from East Africa, which is very active in Kenya, and the Development Bank of Southern Africa were present at that forum, and expressed a fair deal of interest in continuing this engagement. In the French definition of Indo-Pacific, like in the Indian definition, Africa is part of the region, and like in the European definition, there is no doubt about this.
Ambassador, thank you for your question. It's an important one, and it reflects the fragmentation on the continent in response to some of the international conversations that need to take place. And so the way that our conversations would typically be structured is that they would start at the regional level and escalate to the African Union, which I think is the process with other regional groupings. So Africa itself, the AU does not have an Indo-Pacific strategy, but Kenya is developing one, and I believe the same is true of South Africa. And so typically what would happen is that either of the two countries or both would initiate the conversation with their regional economic groupings, whether SADC, COMESA, or the East African Community. And that would then be escalated to the African Union, and that would then give us leeway to engage with the Quad, which, as you say, is quite important. Tragically, we haven't seized the opportunity because, of course, for the other, shall we say, 40 or so countries that don't look towards the Indian Ocean, it hasn't been a priority. It has become a priority, as I said earlier, because of the events in Ukraine, because of the way that the pandemic has played out, but also because of the escalation of transnational crime, whether it's trafficking, whether it's illegal migration. And so my sense is that through the summit that's taking place at the end of next month, where I hear that there have been calls from member states to discuss these issues, we will begin to see, if not formal engagements, certainly informal conversations taking place with forums such as the Quad. Thank you.
Is there anyone else? Yes, sir. Can we have a mic there, please, Janvi?
Thank you. My name is Rajesh Shah, and this is addressed to Minister Aditya Takri. You have very ambitious plans for Mumbai. That's one of the great megapolises of the world, major port city, investment, trade, and the center of all most economic activity of India. So would you like to share some of your thoughts on how Mumbai, the development, particularly in relationship to technology or climate change mitigation activities, and this huge population, 25 million and growing, it can play in this region?
I think for that, I'd love to invite you to Collabo Conversations by ORF in Mumbai. But apart from that, thank you for bringing this very important topic. What's happened is, over the past few years, we've always seen Mumbai as a center of growth. And not just Mumbai at the moment, you've got the entire MMR region, which is the Mumbai metropolitan region, around the city with a couple of more cities growing at a rapid pace. Now, what is very, very important to realize about Maharashtra is it is, in a complex way, extremely difficult to understand in terms of whether it's really agrarian, whether it's really industrialized, financial, urbanized or not, because almost 52 to 53% of our state is urbanized, and we are constantly growing. You've got a couple of more centers. You've got Mumbai, you've got Thane, Navi Mumbai, Aurangabad, Nagpur, a couple of these centers really rapidly growing as industrial centers. Even today for us, if you look at the investments coming in, Pune, of course, is also rapidly growing. Some of these cities have seen them grow from size to size, population to population, but more than that, very importantly, grow in importance for the fintech sector, for the industrial sector, for the marketing world, because you've got multiple agencies coming to Mumbai or Pune, or the whole region between Mumbai and Pune, and settle out. Now, what we need to realize is, apart from just having manufacturing industries, apart from a growing service sector, we're trying to attract more and more financial centers to Mumbai and Maharashtra, and the region, like I said, between Mumbai and Pune, because for us, it is crucial that we maintain the status of Maharashtra being the financial capital of India. You've got banks headquartered out of Maharashtra, you've got financial services out of Maharashtra, but for us as government, what we can play as a role is policy making. And that is where we're looking to partner with multiple agencies, multiple think tanks, processes that can actually ease out, not just ease of doing business, but ease of compliance and ease of living. Because when you're looking at a manufacturing hub today, or when you're looking at a fintech hub today, or anything like a data center, you're not just looking at the space given to a particular office complex or a manufacturing plant. You're also looking at how good can your lifestyle be for families that are coming in, or younger couples that are coming in, or people who are interning out there for staying for a longer term. I think in terms of a changing world post-COVID, we're also looking at many more technological changes and advancements coming into our sector. Now, if we are to support this, our sources of energy have to be clean, green, and yet firm. Our infrastructure has to be growing, be it airports, be it seaports, be it inward movement of logistics or humans. I think this is something that we're focusing on in terms of law and order, peace, security, infrastructural growth, education, healthcare. These are some of the points that we are looking at as the government. Apart from that, one of the most beautiful things about Mumbai and Pune especially has been that these two cities have grown not just because of government policies, they've grown because of public-private partnership. And as long as we've got a sense of security in terms of public investment and private investment coming in together, people loving to stay there, we can move forward. And growth in Maharashtra obviously signifies a growth for the country, and growth for the country obviously signifies a larger growth for the region and the Indo-Pacific, looking at the larger role that India is seeking to play at a global level. So that is how we're looking at it, apart from the collabo conversations.
Well, thanks for plugging that. Is there anyone else? I do actually have a follow-up question for you, Aditya. So my question to you is, in the last 2 years, we have seen that public finance is irreplaceable when it comes to a situation or a crisis like we have seen in the world. And Maharashtra, of course, was very badly affected, but was also very responsive. Are there any key lessons in the utilization of public finance that you can share from the last 2 years?
I think the last 2 years have been a learning for all of us, as a country, as state, as, of course, the world, and in terms of first, how do we respond to the pandemic? Because it was something so new for all of us, and especially us as a new government just taking in and taking over for 5 months and then heading into a pandemic straight. What we've been able to do today is, again, like I said, for us, it's more about public-private partnership. So even in terms of administration, all throughout the times of pandemic, especially after the first lockdown, we've made trigger points in terms of our oxygen usage, our bed utilization in terms of hospitals, in terms of vaccination programs. And if at all, God forbid, if there is another pandemic or we see this pandemic rise, what do we exactly lock down and what essential activities do we keep going? For example, the manufacturing sector, or the service sector, the financial sector, because if we close that down, the country will collapse. So we don't really want to hit that. And if we have to go on with that and we've got to go on with life and livelihood, I think there has to be a balance between both. The biggest learning is balance, because we've sought to learn in terms of how is technology helping us, how is it reducing our travel time and usage of energy, time, money in terms of travel. Most of our briefings from different offices across the collectorates that we have, or divisions and regions we have, are online now. We've seen a lot of businesses come onto platforms like Zoom, WebEx, and Microsoft, and things like that. Yes, there is a COVID fatigue building in. There is a televised fatigue building in. We've always got the mask on our arms rather than on the nose nowadays. But the biggest learning really is, in terms of public finance, in terms of private finance, if we can actually measure what has to go in, measure how we use it, and how we can better cooperate with private individuals, with corporations, with industries, with people, I think that is where the biggest learning is. So when you're investing public finance or private finance, what is very important is to keep our ears to the ground and keep getting feedback and keep correcting ourselves at every step. I think that is very crucial for us as governments around the world.
Do we have more questions from the audience? Yes.
Thanks very much. My name is Evelyn Griffithson from the British High Commission. The panel made some really interesting points about cross-pollination and about kind of exchange and learning from each other. And we're really interested in the UK government on what we can do to support South-South collaboration. So we're working a lot in partnership with India to support India as a global development actor, and to support India to kind of show the lessons that India has learned and kind of and promote those and export those overseas. So I'm particularly interested from the views of the panel and I guess different perspectives on the panel on this, on what are some of the kind of best sectors that we should be targeting when we're looking at South-South development? How can we make sure that those sectors are demand-driven and that you're actually kind of getting the best expertise from different countries and making that exchange work? And then a sort of second part to that question is, what useful role can traditional donors, countries in the global north, actually play in facilitating that? How can they be helpful? Thanks.
Philippe.
Maybe I'll start with a few words about semantics. I don't like the phrase traditional donors, especially when we're talking about a lender. We're not a donor, we're a lender. And it goes beyond semantics, because the sort of things like ownership, demand, are dealt very differently when you're lending than what you do when you're providing grants, number one. So traditional donors, in my view, belongs to history. The subject is no longer about ODA or this sort of thing. The subject is proper development finance. And this might include traditional ODA, wherever this is needed, but increasingly it will be about development finance provided to support sustainable goals or sustainable national strategies and so on. And in this context, there is scope for lots of institutions. What Philippe has demonstrated is that in this context, the role of national regional development bank is much more important than the role of any donor, simply because of the issue of size, which I mentioned. If you want to have an impact in a country like India or a country like Indonesia, it is much important a financial impact to, for instance, work with the State Bank of India or the PTSMI in Indonesia, because the capillarity of these institutions will guarantee that they will reach out to a fairly large number of clients or partners or whatever. That's number one. And that leads me to my second point. I don't know to answer your questions, which would be the preferred sectors for the sort of things that you've mentioned. But I would tend to assume that rather than working on sectors, it would be better to work on actors. For instance, working more closely with India Exim for an agency like AFD, a country like France, seems to be a more interesting avenue for future cooperation, including trilateral cooperation, that defining ex ante a sector in which then you might find it difficult to make coincide the demand of the country, your own interest and the interest of the third partner of the equation. And third point, let's again start from the demand. The example which I gave about national parks is in my view a good example. There is an interest in national parks management in Assam. There is a similar interest in Kenya. And the French National Forestry Administration is playing a role to make this happen.
If I could just add to that, and since you're from the British High Commission, you've already got a fantastic trade commissioner, Alan, who's also the Deputy High Commissioner to Maharashtra and the Western Zone. We've always been working on, for the past 6 or 7 years, we've been working very closely with him, and he was in the British Council earlier, and now as the Deputy High Commissioner. There are sectors, like he said, could be divided into actors or sectors. And what I really find very interesting, especially with India's connection to, the Commonwealth and, Britain, is also that we have a lot of countries as a part of the Commonwealth, apart from the Indo-Pacific, in the larger part of Commonwealth, where we have a shared past and maybe culturally similar or extremely different. But as the world, we have a shared future. And there are sectors where maybe traditional donors or traditional lenders, but I think the sectors and actors that you need to probably invest in or lend to is non-traditional. We need to look at the newer world ahead. In terms of the lending that's been happening, in terms of whatever, be it infrastructure, be it roads, highways, airports, I think going beyond that, if you're looking at lending or anything in terms of exchange. It's just beyond investment of finance. I could be thinking of investment as ideas or technology transfer. Working on SDGs is very, very important in terms of a larger perspective of the world. So I think that is one, be it malnutrition, oral hygiene, women healthcare, healthcare at large, pandemic work, non-pandemic work, COVID, non-COVID, preventive healthcare, curative healthcare. That is one. But I think what is also very important, and when we look at the world, especially the Indo-Pacific or just a global perspective, clean drinking water, clean, firm, renewable sources of energy, green cement, green steel, citizen-built environment. I think these are some of the ideas that we can really work on together in terms of investment as finance or non-finance, because today's world also needs a lot of ideation, thought process, reviewing each other, peer reviews, as you mentioned for the EU. I think if we can do that at a global level, that is something that's really going to take us ahead as the human race, because otherwise we're running out of time and hitting our goals on paper as SDGs 2030. Are we really achieving that? May not be at the current speed. Decarbonizing by 2040, are we doing that? May not be at the current speed. So if we can keep ambitions high and move on that, I think that could be really helpful for all of us.
If I may quickly react also to this question, because triangular cooperation has been quite a tradition in our cooperation system. We in Spain we have more of a focus on Latin America. Traditionally, we've worked quite a lot over there, and it's also a very diverse reality. As I was saying before, the Indo-Pacific countries are very different, very diverse. We have to adapt our means to different environments. It does also happen in Latin America, where you have 8 recipients, but also 8 providers or development providers, and we have quite a lot of experience actually in working with countries in the region, either with Chile in Bolivia or with Mexico and Central America. It does help to exchange experiences and to learn. But maybe what I wanted to also to introduce here, as I think as Philippe was saying, the actors are important. In that sense, when we think of triangular projects, I mean, we can also think of triangular projects in the private sector. We have experience with other Asian partners in Asia, actually, or in Latin America, a lot with Japan, actually, in the case of Spain. Or we can think, and I think it's important that we also think of decentralized cooperation. And in that sense, the participation of regional actors or even municipalities in cooperation projects that are close to the ground, that have the experience, also can enrich basically the exchange of experiences that I was mentioning before. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Yes.
Just a very quick question to our Spanish colleague. If I heard you correctly, you said that the best development policy today is to stop the Ukraine war. By that, you do not imply that EU or Spain's development cooperation will have to wait for that moment, do you?
Well, I hope not. But as I said before, I think what I hope is that the war doesn't last. What I'm implying right now is that a lot of what I was implying before is that the scenario that was relatively positive in the beginning of the year right now looks much more challenging, and that the war in Ukraine is definitely introducing factors that are having a very profound impact in the global south also. What I think is different scenarios, but I think what we hope is that the war will, at least the hostilities will stop. It does create a very dangerous precedent of the international order. What we're having here is a gross violation of the rules-based system that has been governing our lives in the last few years. A system that I think is open to reform, but not by force. When we were talking before, you were talking about the situation of African countries. I don't think that we have to view this conflict as a conflict between Russia and the West. It has nothing, it's not that. It's a conflict, it's an assault on the rules-based order that we all share. When we think of sovereignty, of territorial integrity, those are principles that most countries, basically all countries do share. The fact that we settle our disputes peacefully are elements that are a basis in order to achieve international growth and development too. So it's a precondition to a certain extent. That doesn't mean that we don't have to work also on on development cooperation issues, and we are not doing that. Actually, I was mentioning before, we are with this happening in the middle of the process of reform of the Spanish cooperation system with a new law, and that law was sent to Parliament a couple of weeks ago, so we are not stopping those things.
I want to bring in Uduak and Melinda for the last word. Uduak, specifically for you, I know you want to also come in on one of what we're discussing, but you have worked on gender, and this report talks about building of gender equity and sustainable development, and how we cannot look at resilience of communities without really building the resilience of women after the pandemic. So how can we achieve that through the Indo-Pacific framework?
I actually haven't worked on gender. I'm a journalist, a recovering one. But specifically I think my response to your question and to the question on the South-South cooperation, which is an important one, is the same, which is that in the way that we design our interventions, our support, our partnerships, we can build these things in as a requirement. And so if you are issuing a grant as the FCDO, you can require South-South cooperation, meaning that Aditya has to cooperate with me. I have to cooperate with Aditya. You have existing models, whether it's twinning of cities and various other formats. You can mandate that we cooperate. And it's not, and we do sometimes, chafe at, impositions, particularly from, Western countries, people of a lighter hue. But I think that we've got to sometimes, we need a little bit more encouragement. Aditya talked about the Commonwealth. And so those exchanges typically take place in a top-down manner. They take, we summon ourselves and take ourselves to London. And I think for institutions like the Commonwealth and others, devolving them to the various regions. Okay, the Commonwealth Summit is devolved to the various countries of the Commonwealth, but devolving the engagements, the partnerships to member countries in the same way that you've talked about your cooperation with Latin America. And so building interventions that require lateral collaboration as opposed to top-down or, European or Western-centered, cooperation with countries in the global South, I think would be key. And the same around gender equity. And we've seen that, particularly in the aftermath of the pandemic. We know, certainly, within our context on the continent, girls, were unable to access education, which put them at risk of early pregnancies, women and girls subjected to sexual violence. We know that because women typically earn less than men, that they had no access to income and all the necessities that were required. And so again, building this into our Build Back Better initiatives is key. There's got to be some sort of sensitization. I don't believe that and we see, a spike in China, I don't believe that if we went into another phase, perhaps I'm cynical, but I don't believe that we've done enough harvesting of lessons from this experience to ensure that if we went into another pandemic within a year or two, that we will be able to implement the lessons we've learned from our experiences.
Melinda, would you like to come in?
Thank you. So I wanted to approach the question from a slightly different angle, actually, which is to say that I think the biggest challenge here is how we pull in investment capital alongside public finance and all the other means in order to achieve resilient economies, healthy populations, healthy planet. It is not how do we establish sort of innovative cooperation for cooperation in itself. And for all the reasons I think that have been really eloquently put on that expressed in this panel, it is a different way of looking at the challenge. It means we need a range of actors. We need public and private finance to work alongside each other through mechanisms that need to be innovative, speedy, at pace, bring the best ideas to the table. And it needs ingenuity. And I just think if we can reframe the traditional development narrative into something which feels more relevant for a rapidly changing world where we have brilliant ideas but significant investment need, and think about how we pull capital to where it's most needed in order to propel progress, that is a better way of looking at the challenge. By all means, we need to build on the lessons of the past, understand the inequalities, think really deep and hard about what is driving inequality and the deep features we see in our system as a result of that. But it isn't the solution simply to stare at those things. The solution is to spur progress through making sure that the global capital and financial system is doing the best job it possibly can.
Thank you. And the last word to Philippe. We just heard about, well, actually Melinda just talked about there are brilliant ideas, and what we need is more innovation. We've heard so much from our panelists today. How would you conclude this conversation?
I think, by way of conclusion, I would suggest that the pandemic, the response to climate challenges, and the need to ensure proper mobilization of financial resources and innovations, are all of them calls for better, far forward-looking public policies. We're living an age of rehabilitation of public policies after decades of how should I say, blindness about the capacity of the markets to do everything that the planet was needed. So our times are times during which public policies are being rehabilitated. They can draw upon new instruments, technologies, and so on to make them, turn them more efficient. But fundamentally, what we need are global public policies.
Thank you. With that, we come to the conclusion of this event. I do urge the audience to please see this report. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists.